There is a mansion in one of America's railroad cities that tourists photograph but do not understand. The guided tours emphasize imported marble, hand-carved banisters, and the wealth of the Gilded Age. What they do not emphasize is the system of locks, the reinforced door frames, the placement of servants' quarters where sightlines converge, the fact that every entrance was designed not to welcome guests, but to control them. This was not a home built to display power. It was a home built to protect power from itself. Between the late 1870s and the early 1900s, one of America's most successful railroad magnates transformed a mansion into something closer to a command center. He installed security protocols that would seem excessive even today. He screened visitors with the precision of a military installation. He built hidden corridors and maintained night watchmen and kept files on everyone who crossed his threshold, including family. The house was a fortress, but the enemy was never outside the gates. This is the story of a man who conquered railroads and then spent his fortune learning that signatures are more dangerous than dynamite, that boardrooms are more lethal than labor riots, and that the people you trust enough to let inside are the ones who can destroy you without ever raising their voices. The mansion still stands, preserved, protected, a monument to American achievement. But if you know where to look, it is also a monument to American paranoia. The Gilded Age was not named for gold. It was named for gilding a thin layer of shine over base metal. By the 1870s, American industrial wealth had reached levels that would have embarrassed European aristocracy. Railroad barons, steel magnates, oil consolidators, they built empires in a single generation and fortunes that could fund small nations. They lived in mansions that occupied entire city blocks. They threw parties that cost more than most Americans earned in a lifetime. And they did all of this while the country outside their gates was tearing itself apart. Labor strikes turned into pitched battles. Monopolies crushed competitors with tactics that would later be declared illegal. Political machines sold legislation like groceries. Newspapers screamed about corruption while taking bribes to stay quiet. The law was not absent. It was simply for sale, and the price was reasonable if you had railroads to your name. In this world, reputation was currency. A man could run sweatshops, bribe senators, and crush unions. But if he kept his name clean in the social pages, if he donated to the right charities and attended the right churches, if his wife was seen at the right galas, then he was untouchable. Privacy became the most valuable commodity of all. The truly powerful did not flaunt. They withdrew. They built estates in exclusive neighborhoods where police were cooperative and neighbors were complicit. They constructed lives that looked respectable from the street, but operated by different rules behind closed doors. Geography mattered. In every major American city, there were districts where old money and new money negotiated their coexistence. Streets where mansions stood shoulder to shoulder, each one a statement of arrival and a declaration of separation from the world beyond. To live on those streets meant you had won. To build on those streets meant you intended to keep winning. But by the 1880s, winning was no longer just about making money. It was about protecting it. And protection required more than lawyers and accountants. It required architecture. The railroad baron who built the fortress understood this earlier than most. He understood that walls were not enough, that gates were not enough, that even money was not enough. What he needed was control. And so he built a house where control was not a feature, it was the foundation. He came from nothing, which made him dangerous. The railroad baron's early life followed the template of American mythology. Modest origins, relentless work, strategic ruthlessness disguised as ambition. He started as a clerk in a freight office, learning the movement of goods before he owned a single mile of track. He watched older men make mistakes and filed those mistakes away as lessons. By his 30s, He had acquired his first rail line, not through inheritance or investment, but through a combination of debt leverage and competitor misfortune that was either brilliant timing or patient sabotage, depending on who told the story. What made him different was not his hunger. Every man in his industry was hungry. What made him different was his fear. He feared losing more than he enjoyed winning. He feared rivals more than he trusted allies. And most of all, he feared the machinery of power that he himself had learned to operate, because he knew exactly how easily it could be turned against him. Other railroad men built yachts and collected art and married their daughters to European titles. He built files. He kept records. He maintained networks of informants who reported on partners, employees, investors, even family members. He did not believe in loyalty. He believed in leverage. By the time he reached his peak, when his rail network stretched across multiple states and his name appeared in financial papers as often as weather reports, he had accumulated enemies in every direction. Labor organizers who saw him as a tyrant, rival magnates who wanted his roots, reformers who considered him a symbol of everything broken in American capitalism. But his most dangerous enemies were the ones he dined with. The men on his board of directors, the investors who had funded his early expansions, the family members who would inherit his empire and who watched his decisions with the careful attention of people waiting for a mistake. He was not paranoid without reason. He had seen what happened to men who relaxed. He had watched John Garrett lose control of the Baltimore and Ohio to a boardroom coup. He had studied how Cornelius Vanderbilt's sons waited like vultures for the old man to show weakness. He had read about executives removed, not by scandal or bankruptcy, but by quiet legal maneuvers, guardianships, competency hearings, trusts restructured while the subject was still breathing. In the 1870s, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would build a mansion, not to display wealth, he already had that, not to entertain society. He found society exhausting. He would build a fortress, a place where he could see threats coming, where access was controlled, where every person who entered did so on his terms, under his observation, within his system, where he could finally be safe. Or so he thought. The crisis came in 1877, and it was not what he expected. Labor strikes had been escalating for months. Railroad workers across the country were organizing, demanding better wages and safer conditions. The Baron had prepared for this. He had security contracts with private firms, relationships with sympathetic police chiefs, and contingency plans for replacing striking workers. What he had not prepared for was betrayal from within his own boardroom. During the height of the strikes, when public attention was focused on burning rail yards and violent clashes between workers and hired guards, 3 of his senior investors attempted a quiet restructuring. They used the chaos as cover to push through an emergency vote, claiming the Baron's aggressive labor policies were creating financial risk, and that temporary oversight was needed to protect shareholder value. It was legal. It was bloodless. And it almost worked. The Baron discovered the plot not through his business intelligence network, but by accident, a clerk filing the wrong document in the wrong office at the wrong time. He had 72 hours to respond. He did not respond with violence or public scandal. He responded with precision. He called in debts. He activated relationships with political allies who owed him legislative favors. He threatened to leak financial irregularities that would have destroyed 2 of the conspirators personally, even if it damaged his own company in the process. And he did all of this from his study, through written correspondence and late-night meetings, while maintaining a public appearance of absolute calm. The vote was canceled. The 3 investors quietly exited the company within 6 months. The Baron remained in control. But the lesson was permanent. The real danger was not outside his gates. It was inside his own circles. The people who smiled at dinner. The people who called him by his first name. The people who knew his schedule and his habits and his vulnerabilities. The people who could remove him with paperwork instead of pistols. After 1877, he changed. He became quieter, more systematic. He reduced the number of people he trusted from a handful to almost none. He stopped attending social events unless they served a specific strategic purpose. He began to see every interaction as a potential threat assessment. And he began to think seriously about architecture, about doors that could be locked from the inside, about hallways that could be monitored, about a household staff selected not for skill or charm, but for loyalty and silence, about a home that was not a stage for performance, but a machine for control. Within 2 years, construction would begin. What the Baron was building was not unprecedented. Wealthy men had always protected themselves. Estates had guardhouses. Mansions had servants who screened visitors. Private clubs maintained membership rolls and door policies. But what the Baron envisioned was different in degree and in philosophy. He was not building a house that could be defended. He was building a house that was itself defense. Every element, architectural, operational, social, would serve a security function. Not security from thieves or trespassers, but security from the particular threats that a man of his position faced. The threat of being observed by the wrong people. The threat of being overheard. The threat of being outmaneuvered by people who had access to his private life and could use that access against him. The product he was creating was not luxury. It was invisibility within luxury. Control within hospitality. The appearance of openness with the reality of absolute gatekeeping. Other mansions said, "Look what I have built." His mansion would say, "You may enter only as far as I permit, and you will leave, knowing only what I allow." The key was staff. In a typical Gilded Age mansion, servants were numerous and interchangeable, hired through agencies, paid standard wages, expected to perform domestic labor without asking questions. The Baron's household would function differently. Every employee would be vetted. References would be verified through private investigators. Previous employers would be contacted directly. Anyone with family connections to labor organizing, journalism, or rival business interests would be excluded automatically. Servants would not simply work in the house. They would be integrated into its security apparatus. Footmen would note the names of visitors. Maids would report on conversations overheard during cleaning. The housekeeper would maintain logs of who entered which rooms and when. This was not spying. This was protocol. The Baron did not see it as paranoia. He saw it as basic operational hygiene, the same kind of information control he exercised in his railroad offices, simply extended to his domestic sphere. The second key was access control. Visitors would not arrive casually. Invitations would be specific and limited. Even family members would be expected to announce their intentions in advance. Social calls would be discouraged. Business meetings would occur in designated spaces, never in the family quarters, never in rooms where personal documents might be visible. The mansion would have layers, public rooms where necessary entertaining could occur, semi-private spaces where trusted business associates might be received, and inner sanctums, the Baron's study, his private correspondence room, his bedroom suite, that almost no one would enter. The third key was information asymmetry. The Baron would know more about everyone in his house than they knew about him. He would know their schedules, their relationships, their financial situations. He would maintain files on business partners, family members, even longtime servants. Knowledge was the ultimate fortress, not stone, not locks. Knowledge of who wanted what, who owed whom, who feared exposure, who could be leveraged. By the early 1880s, the mansion was taking shape. Architects received unusual instructions. Contractors signed confidentiality agreements. The construction itself was managed like a military operation, compartmentalized, monitored, secure. Neighbors watched the building rise and assumed they were witnessing another monument to industrial wealth. They were not entirely wrong. But what they were really witnessing was the architecture of fear made physical a fortress, built not against armies, but against handshakes and dinner conversations and signed documents delivered by trusted couriers, against the weapons that the Baron's own class had perfected. The mansion occupied a corner lot in the city's most prestigious residential District A location that signaled arrival while providing clear sightlines in multiple directions. From the street, it appeared imposing, but not theatrical. Stone facade, minimal ornamentation, windows set deeper than architectural fashion suggested. The entrance was recessed, creating a vestibule that forced visitors to pause before reaching the actual front door. That pause was intentional. It created a moment of observation, a moment to be seen before seeing. Inside the vestibule, a second door heavier, with better locks, a butler's station positioned to intercept anyone who entered. No direct sightline into the interior of the house. Every arrival was a controlled revelation. The entry hall was designed to communicate status without vulnerability. Expensive materials, yes, imported marble, dark wood paneling, but arranged to create a sense of enclosure rather than expansiveness. The ceiling was lower than in comparable mansions. The staircase was positioned to prevent casual exploration of the upper floors. Public rooms radiated from the entry in a carefully planned sequence. A formal parlor for receiving visitors who would not be invited deeper. A dining room that could accommodate necessary social obligations. A library that looked impressive but contained no documents of actual importance. These were performance spaces, rooms where the Baron could play the role of gracious host while revealing nothing. The real architecture began beyond them. Private corridors connected the Baron's working spaces, his study, his correspondence room, his meeting chamber, in a configuration that allowed him to move between them without passing through public areas. Servants used separate hallways, creating parallel circulation systems that rarely intersected. The study was positioned at the back of the house with views of the rear garden and the service entrance. The Baron could observe arrivals of staff, deliveries, and service personnel without being seen. Windows were placed to maximize surveillance while minimizing exposure. Inside the study, furniture was arranged to control social geometry. The Baron's desk faced the door, with his back to the window, the position of someone who wanted to see threats coming and did not fear attacks from outside. Visitors sat in chairs positioned slightly lower, slightly farther from the desk than comfortable conversation would require. Every physical detail reinforced hierarchy and information asymmetry. The bedroom suite occupied the entire third floor. Access required using a specific staircase, not the grand public stairs, but a narrower service stair that could be monitored. The Baron's bedroom connected to a private sitting room, a dressing room, and a small office where he worked before dawn and after midnight. No servant entered these rooms without specific summons. Cleaning occurred on a strict schedule, always supervised. Personal papers were kept in a safe that required 2 keys, one held by the Baron, one by his personal secretary, who slept in an adjacent servant's room and who had been selected as much for discretion as for skill. The household staff numbered fewer than in comparable estates. 15 full-time employees, each with clearly defined roles and limited authority. The housekeeper managed domestic operations, but had no access to the Baron's private papers. The butler controlled visitor access, but did not handle correspondence. The secretary managed information but did not supervise staff. Compartmentalization prevented consolidation of knowledge. Security extended beyond personnel. Doors to sensitive rooms had reinforced frames and superior locks. Windows on the ground floor had interior shutters that could be secured from inside. The rear entrance, used primarily for deliveries, was never left unattended during business hours. Night security was managed by a rotating watch system. 2 men, hired through a private firm, maintained overnight surveillance. They did not patrol randomly, but followed specific routes at specific intervals, checking locks and watching for irregularities. The mansion was not armed. It was monitored. By the mid-1880s, the system was operational. The house functioned less like a residence and more like a secure facility that happened to contain living quarters. Visitors who came for dinner remarked on the formality. Family members who stayed overnight noticed the quietness, not the peaceful quiet of a restful home, but the managed quiet of a place where nothing occurred without authorization. The Baron's wife adapted to the protocols, though she found them exhausting. His children learned to announce themselves before entering rooms. Business associates grew accustomed to the screening process, though some found it insulting. But the Baron was not concerned with comfort or insult. He was concerned with control. And inside his fortress, for a few years at least, he had it. The rules were unwritten, but absolute. No one arrived at the mansion unannounced. Not family, not business partners, not old friends claiming spontaneous social calls. Every visit required prior arrangement, communicated through correspondence that was logged and filed. When visitors did arrive, they encountered the butler first, always the butler, never a lesser servant. He verified names against a daily list. He inquired about the purpose of the visit, even when the purpose was already known. He directed visitors to wait in the vestibule, never the entry hall, while he confirmed that the Baron was ready to receive them. This process applied even to the Baron's own children when they visited from their separate households. Once admitted, visitors were escorted to the appropriate room. No wandering. No self-guided exploration. If a business meeting was scheduled for the library, that is where it occurred. Not the study, not the dining room. The physical space reinforced the social boundary. Servants moved through the house on strict schedules. Morning cleaning occurred between 6 and 8, afternoon service between 2 and 4, evening preparation between 6 and 7. Outside those windows, the public rooms remained undisturbed, and the Baron knew that any sound or movement was either himself, his wife, or an intrusion. Silence was enforced through practice rather than rule. Staff were trained to move quietly, speak minimally, and never discuss household affairs outside the mansion walls. The housekeeper conducted monthly reviews, where performance was evaluated, based partly on discretion. Those who failed to maintain appropriate silence were dismissed without ceremony. Money moved through the house in carefully controlled channels. The Baron did not keep cash on the premises beyond what was needed for daily household expenses. Payments to staff occurred through the housekeeper, who distributed wages in sealed envelopes and maintained no records of individual salaries. Business transactions never occurred in the mansion. No contracts signed, no negotiations conducted. The house was a residence, not an office, at least officially. But information moved freely, in one direction. The Baron received daily reports from his household staff. The butler summarized visitor patterns. The housekeeper noted any irregularities in servant behavior. The night watchman provided written logs of their overnight observations. These reports were not casual conversation. They were documented, filed, and referenced when decisions needed to be made about access, employment, or trust. Contemporary accounts describe a particular incident that illustrated the system in operation. A business associate of the Baron, a man who had known him for 15 years and who considered himself a trusted friend, arrived for a scheduled dinner meeting in 1886. He was admitted through the usual process, escorted to the dining room, and seated for what he expected to be a collegial discussion of a potential railroad merger. During the meal, the Baron made casual reference to a conversation the associate had conducted 3 days earlier with a competitor. A conversation that had occurred in a private club late at night, with no witnesses that the associate could identify. The Baron did not accuse, he did not threaten. He simply mentioned the conversation in passing, as if it were common knowledge, and then moved on to other topics. The business associate understood immediately. He was being watched. His movements were known, his loyalties were being tested. He completed the dinner, concluded the business discussion professionally, and never mentioned the incident to anyone. But he also never again assumed that any conversation, in any location, was truly private. The machinery of the fortress extended beyond its walls. Another account, less verifiable but widely repeated in later years, describes the Baron's method for vetting potential servants. Applicants would be interviewed by the housekeeper, who asked standard questions about experience and references. But after the interview concluded and the applicant had left, the housekeeper would pass the name to a private investigator. The investigation was not cursory. It included interviews with previous employers, inquiries into family background, examination of financial records if accessible, and surveillance of the applicant's home neighborhood. This process took 2 to 3 weeks. If the investigation revealed any connection, no matter how distant to labor organizing, journalism, political activism, or rival business interests, the application was rejected without explanation. If the investigation was clean, the applicant was hired on a probationary basis. For the first 6 months, their work was monitored more intensively than normal. Their personal mail was noted, if it arrived at the mansion. Their friendships with other staff were observed. Only after this period did they become fully integrated into the household, and even then, they were never beyond scrutiny. The Baron understood that the fortress was only as secure as the people who staffed it. Trust was not given. It was tested, constantly. And the house silent, orderly, perfectly maintained, was the machine that made that testing possible. Winter 1888. A private dinner for 6. The guest list had been finalized 3 weeks in advance. 2 senior board members from the Baron's Railroad Company, a federal judge whose legal opinion shaped regulatory policy, a banker who controlled financing for Western expansion, and a senator whose committee oversight could make or break the industry. Their wives were not invited. This was not a social occasion. Carriages arrived separately, 15 minutes apart, between 7 and 8 in the evening. Each guest was received by the butler, his name verified against the list, his coat taken, his arrival noted in the logbook kept just inside the butler's station. The dining room had been prepared with precision. Gas lamps turned low enough to create warmth, but bright enough that faces remained clearly visible. The table set, not with the ostentatious silver that might suggest insecurity, but with simple elegance that communicated confidence. Place cards positioned each guest with strategic intention. The judge to the Baron's right the position of honor, but also the position where he could be watched most carefully. The senator across the table, where his reactions to others' comments could be observed. The board members flanking the banker, their seating arrangement suggesting alliance while preventing private conversation. Food was served in 5 courses, French preparation, American ingredients. Each dish appeared and disappeared without fanfare. Servants moved through the room like ghosts, filling glasses and clearing plates with minimal sound and 0 intrusion. Conversation during the meal remained surface level. Railroad expansion, weather patterns affecting harvest transport, the diplomatic tension with European markets. Nothing of substance, nothing that mattered. The Baron watched more than he spoke. He noted who deferred to whom, who interrupted, who waited for consensus before expressing opinions. He observed the micro-hierarchies of power playing out across his dinner table. Hierarchies that would matter when votes were taken, when regulations were written, when the industry faced its next crisis. After dessert, the men retired to the study. This was the actual meeting. Dinner had been theater. The study was business. Brandy was offered, but barely touched. The Baron positioned himself behind his desk, his territory, his advantage. The others arranged themselves in chairs that had been placed with apparent casualness, but which actually controlled sightlines and social geometry. The topic was consolidation. A smaller competitor railroad was failing, and multiple interests wanted to acquire its routes. The question was not whether the Baron's company would make a bid, but how that bid would be coordinated with regulatory approval and financing. The judge explained the legal framework, which arguments would succeed, which would fail, which timelines were realistic. The senator outlined the political considerations, which committees needed persuasion, which newspapers needed management, which public statements would minimize reform backlash. The banker detailed the financing structure, the board members discussed operational integration, and the Baron listened. He had known most of this information already. He had private reports from his own sources that confirmed or contradicted what was being said. The meeting's purpose was not to gather intelligence, it was to observe loyalty, to see whether anyone revealed information they should not have, to test whether any of these men, these powerful, respected men who smiled and drank his brandy, were positioning themselves against him. At one point, the senator made a comment about shareholder concerns, a casual reference to voices on the board, questioning the Baron's aggressive expansion strategy. The phrasing was vague enough to be innocent, but the timing was interesting. The Baron made no visible reaction. He simply noted it, filed it mentally alongside other small discrepancies and unexplained conversations and loyalties that seemed less certain than they once had. The meeting concluded near midnight. Agreements were reached, verbal, nothing documented. The guests departed the way they had arrived, separately, discreetly, their carriages disappearing into the winter darkness. The Baron did not go to bed immediately. He returned to his study and made notes. Who had said what? Who had hesitated before agreeing? Who had watched the others too carefully? In the morning, he would send instructions to his investigators. Certain people needed closer observation. Certain relationships needed verification. The dinner had been a success by conventional measures. Business was advanced. Alliances were maintained. Power was exercised smoothly. But the Baron understood something his guests did not. The peak was not a moment of triumph. The peak was the moment when you had the most to lose, when your position was most visible, when the people around you started calculating whether they could succeed without you or against you. The fortress had protected him for years. The protocols had worked. The surveillance had provided him with information advantages that kept him ahead of threats. But as he sat in his study in the early hours of the morning, reviewing his notes and planning his next moves, he felt the weight of a truth he had always known but never quite accepted. The fortress could not stop what was coming, because what was coming would not announce itself with violence or scandal or external attack. It would arrive in the form of signatures on documents, legal filings, quiet conversations and other private studies. A board resolution passed when he was not in the room. The fortress had been built to see threats, but some threats were invisible until they had already won. By 1890, the political climate was shifting. Progressive reformers were gaining influence. Newspapers were running exposés on railroad monopolies and corporate corruption. Labor organizing was becoming more sophisticated and more militant. Public sentiment was turning against the industrial giants who had built empires through methods that reformers called theft and that business leaders called innovation. The Baron was a natural target. His railroad controlled too much territory. His business practices had crushed too many competitors. His wealth was too visible and his tactics too ruthless. But the real threat was not coming from reformers or newspapers. It was coming from his own board of directors. The same men who had attempted a quiet coup in 1877 had been replaced, but their successors were no more loyal. They were simply more patient. They had watched the Baron operate for over a decade. They had learned his methods. They understood his weaknesses. And they had concluded that he was becoming a liability. Not because of his business decisions, which remained mostly sound. Not because of declining profits, which continued to flow, but because his paranoia was creating operational problems. Business partners were growing tired of the security protocols. Potential investors were insulted by the vetting process. Other railroad executives found the Baron difficult to work with, not because he was incompetent, but because he trusted no one and suspected everyone. The fortress mentality that had protected him was now isolating him. The board members began meeting separately, not secretly. There was no need for secrecy. They met for legitimate business purposes, in legitimate venues, with legitimate agendas. But in the margins of those meetings, a different conversation was occurring. About succession planning, about modernizing management, about whether the company would be stronger under different leadership, about whether the Baron was still mentally fit to run the empire he had built. The language was careful. No one suggested removal. No one questioned his competence directly. But concerns were raised. Observations were shared. Documentation was quietly assembled. The Baron knew something was wrong. His information network brought him fragments of intelligence board members dining together, private conversations at clubs, legal consultations that seemed unusual. But he could not see the full picture. His own security apparatus, designed to protect him from external threats, was poorly suited to detecting a coordinated internal conspiracy that operated entirely within legal and social norms. He responded by tightening control. He increased surveillance of his own staff. He demanded more detailed reports. He restricted access to information even further. This made things worse. His wife noticed the change. He had always been cautious, but now he was withdrawing even from family. Dinners became interrogations. Casual conversations felt like depositions. The mansion, which had always been formal, became oppressive. His personal secretary, who had served him for 8 years, resigned without clear explanation. The official reason was health concerns. The real reason was exhaustion, the psychological toll of working for a man who trusted no one and questioned everything. Replacing the secretary proved difficult. Qualified candidates rejected the position after learning about the working conditions. The Baron eventually hired someone less experienced, which created its own problems, as documentation became less organized and communications less efficient. Small cracks in the machinery. Meanwhile, the board continued its careful work. Legal consultants were retained. Corporate bylaws were reviewed. Precedents were researched. Procedures for leadership transition were clarified. Everything legal. Everything proper. Everything designed to survive challenge. The Baron's lawyers noticed the activity and warned him. But what could he do? He could not accuse his board of conspiracy when they were simply following corporate governance procedures. He could not fire them without cause that would hold up in court. He could not even fully investigate them without revealing his own surveillance methods. Methods that were legally questionable and socially unacceptable. For the first time in his career, he was trapped by the same systems he had mastered. His control over the mansion remained absolute, but his control over the company, the real source of his power, was slipping. In early 1892, he made a critical mistake. During a board meeting, he became confrontational. He accused members of disloyalty without providing evidence. He suggested that some of them were coordinating against him. He demanded absolute compliance and threatened to restructure the board entirely. The accusations were true, but they were unprovable, and the way he delivered them made him appear unstable. The board members responded with careful concern. They suggested that perhaps the Baron was overworked, that perhaps the stress of managing such a large enterprise was affecting his judgment, that perhaps he should consider taking time away from active management while remaining chairman in an honorary capacity. They were gentle. They were respectful. They expressed nothing but admiration for his accomplishments and concern for his well-being, and they began the process of removing him from operational control, not through hostile takeover, not through public scandal, through a guardianship petition based on concerns about his mental health and his capacity to manage his own affairs. The fortress had been designed to stop external enemies, but it could not stop a legal document filed in a courtroom by his own corporate board, supported by medical opinions from doctors who had never examined him, but who were willing to express concerns based on reported behavior. The Baron understood too late what was happening. The real war was not fought with information or surveillance or security protocols. It was fought with paperwork, signatures, legal authority that could transfer power without violence, without scandal, without anything that could be stopped by locks or watchmen or controlled access. The fortress had been a perfect defense against the wrong enemy. The guardianship hearing occurred in June 1892, in a courtroom chosen for its discretion rather than its size. The Baron attended with his lawyers. The board attended with theirs. Family members were present, some supporting him, others maintaining careful neutrality. The judge was the same man who had attended the dinner in 1888. The proceedings were civil. No raised voices, no dramatic accusations, just testimony about concerning behavior, about isolation, about decision-making that seemed increasingly erratic, about a man who had built a great company, but who might no longer be capable of managing it. The Baron's lawyers presented medical evidence of his competence. Character witnesses testified to his continued sharp mind and strategic thinking. But the defense was difficult, because much of what the board alleged was true. He had become isolated. He did distrust everyone. His security measures were excessive. His behavior, when described clinically in legal language, did sound like paranoia. The hearing lasted 3 days. The ruling took another week. The judge did not strip the Baron of all authority. That would have been too dramatic, too cruel. Instead, he appointed a conservatorship, a management structure, where the Baron retained his title and his public position, but where actual decision-making authority transferred to a committee of board members and a court-appointed administrator. For business purposes, for his own protection. Temporary, initially, though everyone understood it would become permanent. The Baron returned to his mansion. He still owned it. He still controlled access. His security protocols remained in place, but he no longer controlled the company that had funded everything. He no longer made decisions that mattered. He had become a ceremonial figure, honored, respected, and powerless. He lived another 8 years. Quiet years. The mansion operated as it always had, but with less purpose. Visitors came less frequently. Business meetings ceased. The fortress had nothing left to defend. He died in 1900, in his bedroom on the 3rd floor, attended by private physicians and watched over by servants who had remained loyal not to the man, but to the salary. After his death, the mansion passed through several owners. None maintained his security systems. The private corridors were opened up. The surveillance protocols were abandoned. The household staff was reduced and then reorganized along conventional lines. By 1910, the mansion had been converted to institutional use. First, as a private club, then as a corporate headquarters, eventually as a foundation office. The interior was modified repeatedly, Walls were moved, rooms were repurposed. The architecture of control was dismantled piece by piece. The fortress became just another building. Today, it stands as a designated landmark. The exterior has been preserved with meticulous attention to historical accuracy. The interior is open for tours twice weekly. Visitors photograph the marble entry, the carved woodwork, the imported fixtures. Educational materials describe the Baron's business achievements, the rise of American railroads, the wealth of the Gilded Age, the architectural fashions of industrial magnates. What they do not describe, what most visitors never learn, is the true purpose of the house. The reinforced doors are still there, but their locks have been replaced with modern hardware. The butler's station remains, converted to a reception desk. The private corridors exist, but are used as storage space. The study where the Baron planned his defenses is now a conference room where non-profit boards meet quarterly. The surveillance system is gone. The protocols are forgotten. The files were destroyed or lost decades ago. Nothing survived that would let you reconstruct how the machine worked. Nothing except the architecture itself if you know how to read it. The placement of doors, the sight lines, the way rooms connect and separate, the physical geometry of control. A few historians have noted the unusual design. Some have speculated about security concerns. But most people see what they expect to see. Another monument to Gilded Age excess, preserved as a reminder of an era when American industry built empires and men with enough money could live like royalty. They are not wrong, but they are not entirely right either. Because what really happened in this mansion was not excess, it was fear. Systematic, architectural, all-consuming fear. The kind of fear that turns a home into a fortress and a life into a siege. And the preservation of the building beautiful, restored, protected by landmark status, is itself a kind of irony. The Baron built the mansion to protect himself from his own world, to create a space where he had absolute control and perfect information and immunity from the people who wanted to take what he had built. He failed. The fortress could not save him, but the fortress survived, preserved, protected, a monument to the very paranoia it could not cure. And every year, thousands of people walk through it, admiring the architecture and taking photographs, never quite understanding what they are looking at. A building designed by fear, maintained by fear, and abandoned when fear could no longer protect the man who built it. Stand on the street today, outside the mansion. The neighborhood has changed. The other Gilded Age estates are mostly gone, demolished, or converted, replaced by modern construction or institutional buildings. But the fortress remains. Stone facade, deep-set windows. The entrance that still creates a pause before you reach the door. Tour guides tell cheerful stories. They point out architectural details. They mention the Baron's business success and his contributions to American infrastructure. They do not mention the surveillance. They do not explain the protocols. They do not show you how the house was designed to protect a man from his own allies. But if you pay attention, if you notice how the rooms connect, how the sight lines work, how the servant spaces parallel the public spaces, you can still see it. The architecture of paranoia, preserved in marble and wood and stone. It raises questions that the landmark designation does not answer. When a man builds a fortress to protect his power, does he end up protecting himself or trapping himself? If the walls cannot stop signatures and legal documents, what exactly are the walls defending? And when wealth becomes indistinguishable from fear, when every relationship is a potential threat, when trust is impossible and control is the only goal, is that power? Or is that a particularly expensive form of prison? The Baron spent millions building his fortress. He hired investigators and maintained surveillance, and controlled every person who entered his house. He succeeded in creating a space where he knew everything and controlled everything and was protected from everyone. And in the end, none of it mattered, because the real threat, the only threat that could actually remove him, was legal authority, paperwork, board votes, a judge's ruling that transferred power with a signature instead of a siege. The fortress could not defend against that. No fortress could. Maybe that is the final lesson of this house. That power built on fear and control and isolation is inherently vulnerable. That walls, no matter how well designed, cannot protect you from the systems you yourself created. That the people you need to trust in order to function are the same people who can destroy you. The Baron understood this too late. He built his fortress after he was already trapped inside the larger machinery of corporate capitalism and legal authority, a machinery that operated by rules he had helped write but could not ultimately control. The mansion stands as a monument to that miscalculation, preserved, protected, beautiful in its way, a fortress that failed to save the man who built it, surviving as evidence of the paranoia that consumed him. If you listen carefully when you visit, beneath the tour guide's cheerful narration, you can almost hear the silence the Baron created, the controlled quiet of a house where nothing happened without permission, where everyone was watched and no one was trusted. That silence is still there, in the walls, in the locks that no longer matter, in the architecture that was designed for a war that could never be won. And the question remains, for anyone who looks closely enough to ask it, what exactly was being preserved when this building was saved? The grandeur of the Gilded Age? The genius of American industry? Or the monument to a man who built a perfect prison and then locked himself inside?